Welcome to the AAAtraq Academy. Here you'll find a series of videos to help improve your understanding of how to ensure your website and your website's content is available to everyone. We help you make sure you don't discriminate online, looking after both your organisations internally and externally to your wider audience. When documents are shared in a digital format, they are shared as a document type called PDF. They are commonly used on websites, and in the same way web pages have to adhere to regulations, PDFs also have to legally comply. This includes to the accessibility guidelines. However, PDFs can be seen as challenging to deal with. Our partner Sitemorse has been reporting on the compliance of websites to the WCAG guidelines, including PDFs, for over 10 years. This video offers an introduction to PDFs, with Mike Carter offering a pragmatic approach to day-to-day management of PDFs.
As part of these many years of testing, we've seen SiteMost clients take many approaches to addressing their website accessibility, but these tend to be focused on web pages. PDFs tend to be neglected for many reasons. This presentation discusses these reasons and ideas about how to address the accessibility of your PDFs. It's called Pragmatic Accessibility because it's based on a very similar weekly presentation we did about how people address the accessibility of their web pages. Before we get going, let's look at the most common things I hear from people who create PDFs or are responsible for publishing them on the website. It highlights a disconnect in responsibility and education. So the first one, I'm responsible for the website content, not PDFs, so I don't need to worry about them. Yeah, I know we're all laughing at this one, but actually I hear this all the time. I create PDFs and send them to the web team, but I don't have anything to do with the website. Often somebody will create a report as a PDF, maybe from Microsoft Word, and have no idea how it's used on the website or the fact that it needs to be accessible. Bottom one here actually comes from one of our own creative agencies. We're a creative agency and we deliver what the client wants. By the way, what's accessibility? Unfortunately, I hear this through quite a lot of agencies as well. The common theme here is this is someone else's responsibility. Okay. You can stop laughing now. If you fall into any of these groups, this presentation might prove useful to you. So in this webinar, we're going to cover where things stand today and how near are website PDFs to being accessible. We're going to look at a little bit about what's the difference between manual and automated accessibility testing and why you should know the difference. Then we're going to look at what people tell me are the most common issues they face when creating accessible PDFs. What strategies are being adopted to address PDF issues, including an example of how SiteMost resolved issues with our own PDFs. Then we're going to look at discussing the common tools used to create and test PDFs for publishing on the website, specifically Microsoft Word, Adobe InDesign, and Adobe Acrobat, including, of course, the new document report from SiteMost. Then, what are the most common PDF accessibility issues that we see when we do automated testing? And finally, a small summary. If you're familiar with the SiteMost Index, you'll know we have a vast amount of data on tests we perform, and thus we can say with confidence the state of the accessibility on websites today. For example, each quarter we assess all the UK local government websites, regardless of if they're a SiteMost client or not. Typically, this involves millions of individual website tests. Unfortunately, we very rarely find a website where all the PDFs are accessible. This sample of websites is typical of what we see across UK local and central government, universities and UK international airlines. We see a consistent picture of between 80 and 90% of PDFs failing at least one automated accessibility test. It's fair to say that almost everywhere you go, you'll find PDFs with accessibility issues. So we're often asked how we obtain this data, and if you don't know about the SiteMost Index, this is what it looks like. The SiteMost Index provides a benchmark as to how websites are performing against a variety of categories, and it's an indication of the quality and compliance of the website. We've been publishing independent audits of public and private sector websites for over 10 years. Go to sitemost.com/index and go explore. One subject we must talk about before we proceed is manual accessibility testing and automated accessibility testing. We mostly hear this about website testing, but it's equally applicable to PDFs. We hear a lot from prospective clients that they have been told only manual testing can cover all WCAG accessibility tests and automated testing cannot do that. Well, that's true. You'll always have to perform some manual testing of your site, and automated testing cannot cover absolutely everything. Remember, I'm saying this from the standpoint of Sitemorse, who do automated testing. There are some tests that need to be performed by people. For example, is the reading order correct for your PDF? Only a person can determine that reliably. So after all that, why should you use automated testing to check your accessibility? The most important reasons are speed, cost, and consistency. Manual testing is very time consuming. It can take an accessibility expert hours to perform every WCAG PDF test on every PDF page manually. Accessibility experts tend to use automated tools to speed up the process anyway, because they don't want to spend their life doing all the manual tests. Employing a large team of accessibility experts for several months to assess your PDFs is usually cost prohibitive. It's much more effective to automate everything that can be automated and manually test the rest. Automated testing also gives you the confidence that you're measuring the same tests over and over again as you apply accessibility improvements to your PDFs. This allows you to plot consistent charts of progress, and an example of this is the chart shown on the right hand side. This sort of chart goes a long way to show that you are making provision for disability and making improvements to your accessibility. So what seem to be the common issues, or in other words, why PDFs don't get fixed? So the first one, no idea how many PDFs exist on the site, so I don't know the size of the issue. Yeah, typically web teams don't know how many pages they have on their website, and equally they don't know how many of these pages link to their own PDFs. Because of this, it's difficult to assess the size of any PDF accessibility issues you might have, and thus they tend to be ignored by the web team, or at least put off to one side whilst they concentrate on the website HTML pages. People who create the PDFs are disconnected from the website team and they're not aware of accessibility. Usually, the web team does not create the PDFs that are published on their website. The most common one I hear is somebody will create a document in Microsoft Word, save as a PDF, then email to the web team to put on the website. The creator is not aware of the rules for accessibility, so it does not occur to them to use the built-in accessibility checker in Microsoft Office. Most people I talk with have no idea it's right there on the ribbon in the review section. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. The website team lack the skills required to update PDFs and fix any accessibility issues. So although the web team are the ones who put the PDFs on the website, typically, they don't know how to use Adobe Acrobat or InDesign, certainly not experts in those tools. Often, the only way they know that a PDF has accessibility issues is from the SiteMost report, and then all they can really do is bounce the problem to the person who created the original PDF. Creating an accessible PDF requires extra work, so involves extra cost. Whatever you use to create your PDFs, you have to do more work to create an accessible one than just ignoring accessibility and churning out the default document. Extra work, unfortunately for accessibility, means extra cost. In the case of InDesign, maybe quite a lot of extra work and changes to your usual workflow. I know some creatives using InDesign who charge 4 times as much to create an accessible PDF. Another way to think about the cost is it's a tiny fraction of the cost of litigation for accessibility discrimination. So when people test the accessibility of PDFs, what rules and techniques do they use? The generally accepted international standard for accessibility tests is based on the standards in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. WCAG is part of the W3C. It is these standards on which Sitemorse base all our accessibility tests. The current version is WCAG 2.1. The techniques for achieving accessibility are in the priorities A, AA, and AAA. For compliance with most legislation requirements, A and AA standards are sufficient. You can sometimes see this referred to specifically in legislation, and I know it's the sort of thing that turns up in the fax you receive in the US when the class action arrives. Yep, they still use fax machines in America. WCAG has 23 PDF techniques. Some can be tested automatically by examining the contents of the PDF, but some others require manual testing, such as checking the reading order. Your PDF strategy. It's important you know it. So here are some of the most popular techniques people are using, either singly or in combination. They're roughly orders in how often I've heard them being considered in a strategy. First one is minimize using PDFs. This includes removing old PDFs from the website entirely. Often when you see a list of all the PDFs on your site, you'll say to yourself, oh, why have we still got that one on the site? Replace PDFs. Where you might have used a PDF in the past, replace it with a web page. For example, it used to be quite common to create a form in a PDF because you had full control over the page layout. So when your site visitor printed out the page, half the form did not end up on page 2, even if the printer was loaded with letter-size paper. PDFs can incorporate online forms, but it's much more common now to have these forms on a web page. Why use a PDF if a web page will suffice? If the PDF just contains text and a few images, this makes a perfectly good web page. One lazy excuse for not doing this is that it's easier to take a PDF and put that on the website than take the text of a document and create a web page from the text. Maybe you should think about this the other way around. It's easier to create a web page from document text than it is to take a PDF with no accessibility at all and turn it into an accessible PDF. So education seems to be low down on the list here, but I think it's probably the most important. The reason I think this will be explained on the next couple of slides, so more about this later. And the final one on this little list is contract requirements. I've not seen a lot of this in the UK, but I know it's something with more traction in the US. The idea is to include the requirement for accessibility in all PDFs created for you by external agencies. Of course, downside of this is it almost certainly mean a higher cost of production, but as mentioned earlier, a lower cost than litigation. Now for an example I mentioned in the previous slide. In Sitemorse, we don't create our own PDFs. We have a couple of external creative agencies creating them for us so they can apply their creative skills to make engaging documents for us. Our agencies use Adobe InDesign to create the PDFs, and once the text and layout has been agreed and gone through several iterations of approval, the PDF ends up on my desk so I can check it for accessibility and apply any accessibility fixes required. The screenshot on the right shows one of our old PDFs being created in InDesign for a sister company of SiteMost called AAAtraq. The agency created the logo from lots of different parts. Once they had got it right, they then copied this to every page in the document. When it arrived on my desk as a PDF and I put it through Adobe Acrobat's accessibility checker and SiteMorse's accessibility checker for PDFs, there were over 300 images with no alt text, mostly from this fragmented logo that was on every single page. If you've ever edited a PDF with Adobe Acrobat, you'll know there's a very good tool to fix the alt text on images, but you have to go through each one, either marking it as decorative or adding some text. Needless to say, doing this 300 times is more than tedious. So what did I do to make life easier for myself? I invested a small amount of time educating my suppliers. I explained to them about the requirements for accessibility and showed them how time-consuming it was to fix the accessibility issues. We looked at how the images were created, and we also looked at how they could mark all the background images as decorative. We also discussed setting the language and title, exporting the PDF with tagging, and as many other things as possible without increasing the production price. The next time a PDF landed on my desk from them, Acrobat and Sitemorse only flagged 7 images. 5 of those provided nothing extra than the accompanying text, so I marked them as decorative, leaving just 2 to add the alt text. Now, the really interesting thing about this whole exercise is that what the agency provided to me still was not 100% accessible. There are still a couple of things I had to do with the alt text and tidy another couple of things up, but it was far easier than what had been provided before without increasing the cost of production. But hang on, what about those ancient PDFs I have that I cannot really change? Well, the regulations for government-funded websites say that if the PDF is not for an administrative process, that is, for example, helping people through the process of dealing with something on your website, then it's okay to not change it and mark it as rel equals archive. The proposed W3 standard for this is to use this attribute called rel equals archive, and that means we will check it exists, but treat it as historical from a document purposes and not check its individual contents. We've got a very good blog article on this. You can go to sitemorse.com/support and select the PDF accessibility tags, and you'll see the full article. These are the tools I see people using the most for creating PDFs and end up on the website. I use all of these myself to differing degrees. Before we get into the tools, it's worth mentioning that some websites, particularly those with enterprise content management system behind them, can generate PDFs automatically from content. I've seen a number of these, but not one used as common as Acrobat or InDesign or Microsoft Word. I've also found that most of these automated PDF generation tools do a splendid job at creating great looking PDFs, but do a terrible job, if at all, of creating accessible ones. Even Adobe says their Acrobat SDK library can create accessible PDFs, but their own PDF SDK library cannot. So let us know if you're using an automated tool to generate PDFs that produces accessible PDFs. We're always very interested to hear about those. So let's go through these. Adobe Acrobat has an excellent accessibility checker. It also has an accessibility wizard that can help you through the process of tagging untagged PDFs and walking you through fixing issues. It's especially good at examining the reading order and contains its own built-in PDF audio screen reader. I will recommend it as one of the checks to use as part of your PDF publishing workflow. I have it as an essential part of my PDF checking workflow, and the upper screenshot on the right shows it with the reading order tool open. The accessibility checker built into Microsoft Office documents is pretty good. It tends to make a good job of the accessibility when you save as PDF. Many websites receive PDFs from other parts of their organization that have been created in Microsoft Word, then saved as PDF. Using the accessibility checker first will create much more accessible PDFs. The lower screenshot on the right shows an example for PowerPoint with the accessibility checker tool open. If you look carefully, you will see this is a screenshot of the accessibility checker for the page I'm presenting at the moment, and it contains a screenshot of the accessibility checker, which contains a screenshot of the accessibility. You get it, like the 1970s top of the pops special effects. In my experience, almost all glossy and engaging brochures that end up as PDFs start out in Adobe InDesign. It's a complex tool and requires specialized skills, but there seems to be a lack of awareness of accessibility by designers who have InDesign skills. There's no built-in accessibility checker for InDesign, and Adobe recommends saving as PDF and using the accessibility checker in Adobe Acrobat, which I've just spoken about earlier. Sitemorse has a number of ways to check the accessibility of your PDFs, and we'll discuss those in more detail in the next 3 slides. SiteMost can provide you with a very detailed report of all the accessibility issues we've found based on WCAG 2.1 for web pages and PDFs. If you're interested in the detail of the SiteMost automated tests for PDFs, you can view the detailed report and filter by just PDF issues. This gives you a detailed list of all the WCAG 2.1 PDF accessibility issues we found. We even link to the relevant page on the WCAG website so you can read about the detail of the WCAG test. Those of you who are already SiteMost clients and receive these reports will be very familiar with these screens, the ones shown on the right. If you're just interested in testing a single PDF, there are a couple of ways you can do this in SiteMost, depending on how you need to test it. Both are in the On Demand section of your digital properties if you're a SiteMost client. If you want to test the accessibility of a PDF that is already on your website, you enter the URL and tick the box to let us know it's a PDF. After a few seconds, you'll see a detailed report with all the issues we've found within that PDF. As well as the accessibility issues, it also includes other issues such as broken links and bad email addresses. It's the screenshot in the upper right. If you just finished editing a PDF that's not been published on your website yet, you can upload the PDF from your computer and we perform the same test as above. This is a good way to make sure you have corrected everything before you make it public on your website. It's the screenshot on the lower right. I use the second one as part of my workflow with PDFs. Often I want to cycle through, correct and test a few times before I'm finally happy to push it live on the website. The SiteMost document report. This is a new report. It runs every quarter and it looks at all the documents we can find on your site. That is, the documents that are linked from your web pages. We email this to you as a spreadsheet. So why a spreadsheet? When we ask SiteMost clients how they address issues with website PDFs, they told us it almost always involves a different part of the organization from the web team. It might be staff who use Microsoft Office to save as PDF, or it might be a third party using Adobe InDesign. Typically, the SiteMost client would download their SiteMost website report as a big spreadsheet, then delete all the data that did not relate to PDFs, then send this list to the teams that created the PDFs. We decided to cut straight to the chase and email the spreadsheet directly. So the information is divided into several sheets. There's a summary sheet, which gives you a summary of all the documents that we found. There's a PDF sheet. What this shows you is all the PDFs that we have found on your site and all the links to those PDFs, regardless of whether there was a fault that we found in the PDF or not. We have a sheet that's just the PDFs that contain broken links, a sheet for the PDFs along with their accessibility tests. There's a sheet for all the PDFs that we found that contained bad email addresses. There's a sheet for the PDFs where we found duplicates. That is, we found exactly the same PDF, but it was served to us from your web server across different URLs. Often, this is because someone in the web team has liked the look of a PDF. They will then upload it to the website and link to it from a page. And someone else in the web team has done exactly the same thing, and maybe someone else. So you've got several copies of the same PDF on your web server. There's a sheet for PDFs that are missing. That is, your web pages were linking to a PDF on your site, but we couldn't find that PDF. There's also a couple of sheets because whilst we're looking through all the documents on your website, we find all the Microsoft Office documents as well. So there's an MS Office sheet and an MS Office with broken link sheet. And when we're talking about MS Office there, we are talking about Word, Excel and PowerPoint. Notice 3 of these are bold and underlined. If PDF accessibility is your main concern, you might be tempted to go straight to that sheet and spend all your time there doing your analysis and creating your pivot tables. Don't ignore these other underlined sheets. The summary sheet tells you the size of the problem you're facing because it tells you how many PDFs we found. If we only found 200 PDFs, your strategy might be very different to say, for example, if we find 5,000 PDFs. By the way, we find several thousand PDFs on most local government sites. Remember, this was one of the common issues a few slides ago. This sheet gives you the answer to that question. The PDF sheet contains a list of all the PDFs and which pages link to them, regardless of if we found any issues or not. If part of your strategy is to remove PDFs from your site wherever possible, this is a convenient list of pages you'll need to update when you remove those PDFs. And if you are removing those PDFs, you will have to update those page links. The PDF duplicate sheet contains a list of PDFs that were identical but found on different URLs. So if part of your strategy is to correct the accessibility of your PDFs, then what you want to make sure is you're not doubling or tripling work by correcting identical copies of PDFs across your site. So maybe one of the first things you want to do is to remove those duplicates. So here are some general tips for saving PDFs. For Microsoft Office documents, saved as PDFs, you already have the tool. What you should do is educate your PDF creators and make it part of your workflow. If they keep forgetting, there are tools you can employ. One example we use in marketing at Sitemorse is Dania Software's accessibility checker, which takes you through all the steps to make sure the PDF you create is accessible. For Adobe Acrobat, invest time in learning how to use the built-in accessibility tool. Even if it's the only thing you ever use in Adobe Acrobat, it's worth the monthly fee just for that. It's probably the only way you'll have to fix PDFs that turn up on your desk, and it's particularly good for the reading order. For InDesign, educate your designers and make sure they include a few small additions as part of their workflow. These are to set titles and languages when exporting to PDF, create tagging structures, and if you can, make them test with Adobe Acrobat before they send it to you. You could always enforce this by contract if they are external to your organization, but typically they will charge more for the extra work. Educating everybody concerned is probably the best tip for ensuring accessibility of your PDFs. On this next couple of slides, I want to point out some issues that we see all the time in almost every PDF we examine. Here are two issues we see with almost every PDF because it's set in the document properties rather than in the visible text. It's very easy to fix these, so please fix them. Microsoft Word usually does a good job at getting these right because it already knows the language, because it's trying to spell check, and you can set the title in the document properties. Adobe Acrobat's accessibility checker is a nice, easy tool to fix both the title and language if they've not already been set. And for InDesign, you can set these when you do an interactive PDF export. They're there on the dialog right in front of you. In all three of the above, it's almost no extra work, so there's not really an excuse for ever having these in your PDFs. Another common issue we see is with images, either not marked as decorative or not containing information about the image. People will choose a PDF over a web page when they want to create stunning imagery and really make a document stand out. In a lot of these cases, the imagery is usually literally decorative. Make sure you're not the one having to test 300 images as decorative because your brochure agency didn't. This might be where you need to do a few manual checks as well. You need to check that any image that contains information that is not in the text of the document is properly described. For example, if there's an image of a bar chart with percentages of PDFs passing WCAG 2.1 for each section of your website, and those percentages are not described in the text, then how can somebody using a screen reader find the information? In this case, you need to describe the image in the alt text. If you're not sure what's a good alt text, Imagine describing the information in the image to someone over the phone. In summary, here are a few things to remember. If you've not got a PDF strategy, then now is the time to collect up all the information and define one. One part of your strategy might be to mark old PDFs as archived wherever possible. Education is key, so your target should be to make accessibility habitual. The next time anybody in your organization creates a PDF, they should be thinking about how it affects accessibility. Even if the PDF is never going anywhere near the website, accessibility is a good thing to have in everything you do. In the same way you might proofread your MS Word doc before you save it as a final version, you should open it using the accessibility checker as part of just proofing checks. Sometimes you need to enforce a process to get people to do that little bit of extra work. It's worth it, particularly if it means fixing the accessibility of your PDFs. PDFs are not going away in the near future, so they won't stop being added to your website. That means you cannot stop either.
AAAtraq, ADA compliance for good.